Sometimes, when certain places, certain structures built by humans for humans become very old, things that are not human move in. This is particularly true of ancient places, ruins, stone circles, ring forts, and wells, but it can also be true of somewhat newer structures, castles, churches, abbeys, inns, and even libraries, any place infused with history and with meaning. Most of us have had that feeling upon visiting one of these spots, that shivery sense that even though humans may have once dwelt here, and perhaps still do, something else lurks between the walls. In England, in the Middle Ages, cellars in monasteries where food and alcohol was stored for visiting strangers were called butteries. Over time, residents began to notice that the butteries attracted not only human guests, but the other kind as well. These unseen guests were nicknamed Buttery Sprites for their tendency to haunt butteries and to gain access to the larger house through these dark and cool rooms. When Buttery Sprites move in, the symptoms are very much like those of a traditional haunting. Whispered voices, the creaking of floors, the rattling of windows, inexplicable cold spots, a blow of breath on the neck from no one, lost items, shifted furniture, and the feeling of being watched from the shadows. And like in traditional hauntings, the Buttery Sprites have never been physically described, apart from as flitting shadows or tiny floating lights. For this reason, the Buttery Sprites are believed to be invisible, or else to be shapeshifters able to disguise themselves as ordinary humans, as visitors, guests, or even doubles of residents. One way to tell if you're dealing with Buttery Sprites as opposed to ordinary ghosts is to leave out an offering of fresh butter or some buttery pastry, which these fairies can't resist and will leave the plate disturbed by morning. Why the Buttery Sprites prefer old and ancient buildings is unknown, though there are many theories. One theory suggests that the hundreds of years of human experiences that have passed through these places has made them thin, cracked the invisible wall that separates our world from the other. If this is the case, then perhaps the whispers of the Buttery Sprites are in fact the whispers of beings living out their own lives, their own passions and dramas in another world, and that we are just occasionally overhearing them as a neighbor would in a building with thin walls. But it could also be that the Buttery Sprites are aware of these thin places, that they use them as passageways to travel back and forth between worlds. Whether these places are passageways or not, it seems clear that certain mischievous sprites like to linger in them and play pranks on the humans dwelling there. Like all the fairies, the Buttery Sprites keep to a strict set of moral rules and will punish humans who break them. And so tales of the Buttery Sprites include stories of sabotage and harassment. They are particularly known to target the miserly, the lazy, and hypocrites of all sorts, especially abbots, priests, and other holy types who don't keep their vows or practice what they preach. Churches, abbeys, and monasteries where a hypocrite lives are highly susceptible to poltergeist-like activity from Buttery Sprites, who won't cease their disturbances until the offending behavior is stopped, and maybe not even then. Their reasons for doing this are difficult to guess. Perhaps these self-appointed enforcers of fairy law are acting out of a guilty conscience. Having committed a crime against fairy, they seek redemption by punishing humans who have done something similar. Perhaps they have been victims of some crime by a fairy too powerful to pay, and so seek revenge on some similarly guilty target. Or perhaps they just enjoy wreaking havoc and any excuse will do. We may never know, for the motivations of the fairies remain as mysterious as the feelings these old places stir inside us. The best we can do is tread carefully when we visit these spots, preserve them and respect them, for over time, these sacred structures stopped belonging to us alone. Here are 4 possible encounters with these mysterious and territorial fairies. I was at Oxford University in the Fellows Garden, which is a beautiful natural area with trees and shrubs and flowers. I was lying in the grass after my last exam when I glanced over at a nearby flower bed and saw 4 creatures, maybe 25 centimeters tall. They were humanoid, hairless, with spindly limbs and slightly shiny, leathery skin. They wore nothing but Oxford commoners' gowns, no mortarboards, and were gathered under some vegetation. Rhubarb it might have been. They were smiley, fast-moving. They noticed me watching them, and very deliberately, one put its finger to its mouth, as if to tell me to keep their presence a secret. It was truly, truly amazing. I knew they were fairies right away. It just fit, and I didn't consider they could be anything else. Then, just like that, they were gone. But I'll never forget the experience. In about 1933, my father, who was then about 15 years old, was sitting in the grounds of an abbey in County Kerry, Ireland. He was the son of a Church of Ireland rector. He was reading and was very absorbed by his book, but looking up from it, he saw 3 little men in the vicinity of the abbey. 2 of them appeared to be having a boisterous but friendly dispute over some sort of bag, which they were pulling to and fro between them. He could see their teeth gleaming as they laughed. The third was older looking, somewhat wizened, and stood apart from the 2 disputers. Then he turned to look at my father. Their eyes met, and in a flash the 3 fairies disappeared. My father returned to the spot with my mother some 15 years later, and once again he glimpsed the older fairy, but only for a few moments, and alone this time. The appearance of these fairies was conventional. That is, my father cannot remember precisely what they wore, except that their clothing was greenish and brownish, monkish tunics, he thought, tied around the waist. They were about 4 feet tall. The second fairy sighting I'd like to record happened to my aunt, my father's sister. She was very close to a local vicar who died quite suddenly sometime in the 1930s, I think. After the death, but before the burial, she was sitting in a deck chair in the sun, in the orchard of her house in County Laois. She was reading a book, but gradually became aware of the sound of many small voices. This puzzled her, and she wondered if a radio had been left on somewhere. Finally, she looked around and saw, coming through the orchard towards her, the vicar, who had died, looking pale and stricken. And he was surrounded, and indeed pulled along, by several fairy people about the size of small children, clasping his cassock. Shocked, she immediately jumped up and ran inside the house. This strange incident very much upset my aunt, and she told no one except my father, who told me. We are reminded of the fairy lore that humans are particularly vulnerable to be taken by the fairies in such transitional states as the vicar was in, i.e. dead, but not interred. I have left out the names of the participants in these sightings because they might disturb existing members of my family. I was 13 years old when this happened. We were on a family holiday in France and stayed in an old silk mill. There was a garden and an acre of grassland that led to a ruined house and a water well. If you passed through the ruined house, you'd reach a dried-up river. It was clear that usually the water would flow through, but extreme summer heat had reduced it to a slow trickle with several deeper pools. Me and my sisters would explore the area a lot, and we found strange burrows made out of thorns and blackberry bushes. One time, I thought I saw something big move at the bottom of one of the deeper pools, but afraid it might be Peg Powler or Jenny Greenteeth, I didn't stay to investigate. One day, I was walking alone far down the dried river. Slowly, an uncanny feeling started to build up. The wind playing through the trees, getting stronger and stronger, as if blowing a warning. It got so strong I decided I should go back. But the moment I turned around, the wind started blowing even harder. On the riverbank, the trees were wildly shaking. I sped up, and that's when I noticed figures shooting through the trees on the forested riverbank. They were humanoid creatures, slightly shorter than a human adult would have been, but not sturdy at all, with long, delicate limbs. They were very pale, almost a luminescent white. Their hair was also a white silver gray, darker than their bodies. They wore no clothes, but their bodies were covered in moss that seemed to be growing out of them naturally. By now I had broken out into a sprint, feeling really scared and unwelcome. And they chased me. They were hunting me, throwing sticks and rocks at me. I never quite got to see their faces. I was running too fast, but they were moving at an incredible speed, sometimes on all fours. It was like how wolves chase people through the woods in the movies. They move through the thick trees and you can never quite see where they are, but you know they're there. It was very hard to see the entrance to the ruined house from the riverbank, but it was the only way out. As I scrambled back up the bank and into the house, the ruckus stopped. The wind stopped blowing and I couldn't see the creatures anymore. But somehow, not seeing them was even scarier than seeing them, especially because I could still feel them watching me. While making my way out the other side of the ruined house, a bright green snake dropped from a tree nearby. I have no clue if this was in any way related to the creatures I had seen, but it made the experience all the more surreal. I later went back there, and while the place still had that mysterious aura it had had since day one, I didn't see the creatures. Though I did see traces of them there, as the burrows seemed lived in. Whatever these creatures were, I believe them to stand in contact with nature. They seem to have a strong connection to the area where I found them, and don't like to be disturbed. When I was a freshman in college, I took the summer off to work to make some extra money to support my family. There wasn't much in the way of decent jobs where I lived, as the local economy sucked, but I managed to score a pretty sweet deal. I'm Native American, and the local tribe sponsors a program where people under the age of 25 can choose a local job and work in exchange for the tribe paying them, instead of the business. I had a few prospects, but settled on a custodial job at a local church. I thought it would be nice to lend a hand to them, as the church did a lot for our community. The job was easy and the pay was nice for what it was. I'd arrive around 7 a.m. to pick up what little accumulated on the lawn, move inside to vacuum where necessary, and service the bathrooms. The only complaint I had with the job was that the church didn't have the money to run the AC during the week when no one was there, so the church was extremely hot inside. But aside from that, everything was really great. I enjoyed being able to work on my own, and the peace and quiet was much appreciated. Let me tell you a little bit about the church. It was the second largest in town, but it wasn't too terribly massive. There were probably 50 or so rooms, with about 2 to 3 sub-rooms within those rooms. Most of them were rarely used though, so I didn't have to bother with regular cleanings. There were a few other things that made the job interesting though. The church had a problem with vandals breaking in from time to time, so when I got there in the morning, I always locked the doors behind me as I moved through the building. I always double-checked the entry/exit doors once I arrived to make sure they were locked and secure as well. I was there by myself, but I figured my car parked in front would dissuade anyone from wanting to break in. Another quirk was that the building had been built with an absence of windows. The main sanctuary was the only room that had any windows, save for the window on one entry door, important later, and thus was the only room that wasn't pitch black when the lights were off. The first month of work was pretty uneventful. I can't really remember anything exceptionally creepy, but then if anything had been going on, I probably dismissed it. The first truly odd thing that happened seemed to come out of nowhere. It was the middle of the day and I had been vacuuming and checking rooms, and all of a sudden I started to feel really ill. It was hot in there, so I wanted to make sure I wasn't dehydrated. I went to the back center hall where a water fountain was and made sure to drink plenty of water. I sat on a bench. The center hall was the only lit area in the building as I had turned the breakers off to save the church money on utilities. As I sat on the bench, I started to feel ill again, only it felt different this time. I got this odd feeling in the front of my head. It's hard to describe, but it felt like someone had their hand in my brain and was groping around. The next thing I knew, I fell over on the bench and passed out. I was only out for half an hour, but while I was out, I remember having a vivid nightmare. In my nightmare, I was alone in a poorly lit dining hall. A great table was in the center, and luxury chairs surrounded it. A feast had been set out. The only light in the room was from the candles on the table. I started to sit down to figure out what was going on, but before I could, I noticed something odd about the shadows cast by the candlelight. The lights cast only one shadow. At the far end of the table, the shadow cast the silhouette of a large figure sitting in the head chair. The silhouette was massive and looked to be that of an 8-foot-tall man. I didn't know much, but I knew to fear whatever was making that shadow. I got up from the table to run away, but there was no door to exit. The last part of the dream I remembered was me cowering on the floor while the silhouette loomed over me like a cat over a doomed mouse. I woke up at that point, but when I opened my eyes, I couldn't move the rest of my body. I stared forward, and for a brief second, I could have sworn the figure from my dream was standing over me. I fought with all of my might to move any part of my body, but to no avail, and I passed out again. I woke up shortly thereafter, frightened and sore all over. I felt like I'd been hit by a truck, but I dismissed it all as a bad dream, heat-induced. I didn't let it get to me too much, and I finished my day. The next day when I moved in the church, something seemed off. I still can't put my finger on it, but the lights seemed to have a strange glow to them, and the hallways didn't feel so empty. I tried to ignore it and get my job done quickly so I could leave the main building. Over the next few days, I suffered several more instances of what I now know to be sleep paralysis. I would sit down for a break, get that strange feeling in my head, and pass out. Each time I had that same dream with only slight variations. The only thing that ever happened differently was that I'd run to a different corner of the room to get away, but to no avail. I started dreading going to work, but I needed the money. A few weeks passed and things seemed like they were starting to get back to normal. I'd stopped having the sleep paralysis and I thought whatever was going on was over. I couldn't have been more wrong. It was nearing the end of my day. I'd just finished cleaning one wing and had moved to the center hall, where the water fountain was. I turned the lights off in the hallway I'd just been working on and turned the lights on in the hallway I was now working on. I started vacuuming when I noticed something odd. The lights in the hall I'd previously turned off were on again. I initially dismissed it as me forgetting and tried to work, but I kept getting this awful feeling. When I got to the far end of the center hall, away from the one I'd previously cleaned, I heard a loud crash. I rushed back to the hall, thinking the ceiling must have collapsed or something, only to find that nothing seemed to have been disturbed. Bewildered, I decided it would be best to forget the whole thing and get back to work. As I was at the point in the hall where I'd heard the loud crash, I heard another sound. It was a door hinge, creaking. I turned quickly to see one of the Sunday school classroom doors swinging slowly back and forth, like it had just been opened. That door had a faulty knob, so it would never close if you just let it fall shut. The light in the classroom was on, but as I stared, the light turned off. At that point, all I could think was someone must have broken in. I was scared, but also angry, as I knew the sub-room from that room was where the children's fundraising money was kept in. I wasn't about to let someone steal from the church. I said, in the most authoritative voice I could muster, "I know you're in there. Come out now and we can forget this ever happened. I'll let you walk away, and if you do what I say, I won't even call the cops." That last part was a lie. I had every intention of calling the police, but for now I was locked inside with an intruder. Slowly approaching the classroom, I pulled out my utility knife. When I got to the door, I pushed it forward and entered the room quickly, knife in one hand and a flashlight in the other, looking in both directions. When I saw no one, I moved to the sub-room and checked it out. Again, I saw no one. I went back to the light switch and flipped it on. I swear I checked every square inch of that room. No one was in there. At this point, I was very unsettled. It was about 3:45, so I decided I'd finish the rest of the cleaning later. I turned the lights off again, this time feeling dread with every switch flipped off. As I was at the end of the center hall, again, almost where I'd been standing when I heard the other noises, I heard the door creak again. I turned quickly, shining my light down the hall to see the door moving back and forth again. The light flickered on again, only this time it was different. The light was on, but there was a darkness in the room so black that it seemed to be eating the light surrounding it. I didn't care anymore. I turned to run out of there as fast as I could. I heard the door behind me slam open, followed by the sound of large, lumbering steps following me down the hall. I ran to an exit door at the other far end, quickly unlocking the door and tumbling out, falling to the ground. I got back up and pushed the door closed, reaching for my keys to lock it. I held the door closed, but could feel someone on the other side pressing against it with a tremendous amount of force. I looked through the glass window on the door, but I couldn't see anyone on the other side. Whatever was pressing against the door was slowly winning ground. I dug my feet in, but I felt my boots start to slide on the paved walkway. The muscles in my upper body burned and cramped from exuding as much force as I was physically capable of. I knew I was going to lose this struggle. Eventually, after what seemed like forever, the pressure stopped and I was able to shut the door all the way, reach for my key and lock it. I bolted to my car and drove away, trying my best not to have a panic attack. I called in sick the next day, which was luckily a Friday. You couldn't imagine how relieved I was that the next week was the end of my regular duties, and the church put me to work volunteering at their youth event out of town. I never told anyone about what happened. A few months afterwards, I found out that the pastor of the church had started an affair with a woman he met online. He had started the affair at about the time I had the first instance of sleep paralysis. Worse yet, he left one Thursday to finally go meet her in person. And you guessed it, it was a Thursday when stuff seriously went down for me. I'd actually seen him grabbing some stuff from his office across the street from the church that morning. He told me he was leaving for a convention, but he was actually leaving to meet the woman he'd met. Before all of this came to light, Near when this happened to me, he told the church he was stepping down to take care of his terminally ill wife. That was a lie. He shortly left his wife and their children, cleaned out their bank account, and left his family without a penny. Thankfully, the initial prognosis on his wife was wrong. She made a full recovery, and her family was taken care of by the church until arrangements could be made for them to live on. I can't help but feel his actions are what caused, well, whatever the hell was in that church. I can't be sure, but I think his actions invited something in. That wasn't my last time dealing with such an entity, but I still count it as one of the most frightening moments of my life. Thanks for watching. The first 3 stories in this video came courtesy of the Fairy Census. I edited those stories just to make them more friendly for narration, but if you want to read the originals, the link is in the description. The last story is from Reddit, and I'd like to thank the poster for giving me permission to narrate it. That one was also edited just for length, and the link to the original is in the description. As always, special thanks goes out to all my supporters on Patreon. I really appreciate you guys so much and the support you are giving this work. If you like this content and would like to support it, please check out my Patreon page. The link is in the description below. I'm always collecting your true fairy stories, so please send them to me if you have any experiences you'd like to share. I'd love to read them. My email is in the description. Also, please keep sending me your fairy artwork along with a link to your social media page if you'd like me to share your work on my Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter feeds. Don't forget to comment below, like, share, and subscribe if you're new, and hit the bell to receive notification for new videos. And until next time, this has been a visit from your Scary Fairy Godmother.